Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody that has joined our CIPE Youth Leadership Conference. We're so pleased to have you with us today. We are going to be hearing from our first of 5 youth leaders, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce her, and then we will have some time for Q&A with her as well. Her name is Doris Mwikali. She is a social impact advocate who is passionate about the creation of partnerships and integrated approaches towards the achievement of sustainable development goals. Doris is currently the head of partnerships for the UN Conference on Trade and Development Youth Action Hub in Kenya, and she recently joined the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network Youth as a deputy project lead for the education and capacity building pillar for the SDG student program. Doris's project that she conducted during our youth leadership program over the last few months aims to support 5 refugee youth businesses in the Kakuma Refugee Camp in Kenya. Doris also worked to conduct online workshops and various other forms of advocacy to connect refugee youth entrepreneurs with stakeholders in the private sector and civil society. Turning it over to you, Doris. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you, Ritika, for the introduction. My name is Doris Mwikali. I'm a CIPE youth leader from Kenya, working on a youth and private enterprise project in Kakuma Refugee Camp in Turkana West that has a 40% refugee population. My project focuses on financial inclusion of refugees and other marginalized communities in the host community of Turkana West. I'm a young person passionate about market-oriented solutions such as financial inclusion and the role they play in the expansion of the social protection of these protected groups. My motivation to implement this project was not out of charity, but was out of the deep respect that I have for refugee entrepreneurs and their families, the resilience of refugee entrepreneurs and their families. As I will illustrate in my project and my youth corner, is that refugees, as I will illustrate in my presentation and my youth corner, refugees embody the endurance of the human spirit. Thank you for having me, and I will proceed with my presentation. So let me just move to my first slide. Yes, I've already introduced myself, so let me go to the agenda of my presentation. My presentation will focus on the following issues. What is financial inclusion? Why is financial inclusion of refugees an important issue? The distinction between refugees and migrants. And then I'll also look into an analysis of Kakuma Refugee Camp as a marketplace. And then I'll also highlight the advocacy activities that I undertook in my implementation of it, and the challenges and recommendations governments and private sector as they accelerate the financial inclusion of refugees. And finally, steps moving forward to ensure that refugees are financially included, to ensure that no one is left in the development agenda, On my first slide, it's an introduction to what is financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is defined as the access to useful and affordable financial services by individuals and businesses. Financial inclusion also includes the segment of having these services delivered in a responsible and sustainable way. Many refugee youth around the world are able to not access banks or mainstream banking services, and this creates an enormous hurdle to their way to self-reliance and economic independence. And driven by necessity and a lack of employment opportunities in the camp, many refugee youth are currently leveraging on entrepreneurship as a way to expand their social protection. However, the lack of sustainable financial services represents an enormous stumbling block to their financial success. This brings me to why financial inclusion is important and why stakeholders, especially the private sector, should address the financial inclusion of refugee youth entrepreneurs. And to my next slide. Yes. The importance of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is important as it helps young refugee entrepreneurs to be able to rebuild their lives, and not just only to rebuild their lives, but become active economic actors of host communities like Kenya. Due to the procrastinated nature of forced displacement, it impacts the way refugees are able to sustain their dignity and access to economic opportunities. Financial inclusion is one of the sustainable ways in which stakeholders can address the refugee humanitarian crisis, as it enables refugees empowered, it enables them to be resilient, and also it enables their durable protection, as this is a protected class. Financial inclusion is also important. It enables host communities like that in Turkana West to receive much needed support, as mostly the communities that host refugees are also marginalized. So financial inclusion helps to build robust economic bubbles in host communities that host refugees. Financial inclusion also is a pathway to ensure that refugees become economically stable, to be able to go back to their countries, to rebuild these conflict countries, to make them to have more inclusive and resilient economy, especially that COVID-19 has showcased the inequalities. It is important for these people to be supported, to be able to rebuild not only their lives, but also to rebuild their communities and their countries. That's the importance of financial inclusion, and that's why as a CIPE leader, I felt like it was important for me to implement this project, because these people are forcibly displaced, already showing the kind of resilience they already created crisis within the camps. So it's important for stakeholders to support them. Moving on to the next slide. Next slide. Sorry. Okay. I want to make a clear distinction between refugees and immigrants, because I feel like it's important for us to make this distinction to show why refugees are a unique protected class. Refugees are people that are fleeing armed conflict or persecution, while immigrants are people who tend to leave their countries in search of better livelihoods. Refugees have very little choice on what happens in regards to their fate. Therefore, it's important for stakeholders to invest in the social economic issues that affect refugees, like financial inclusion. I feel like it's important for me to make this distinction. We live in a world where there's a lot of misinformation, and there's also a lot of hostility towards refugees. So it was important for me to make this unique distinction to show why I'm focusing on this project and why it's important. Moving on to the next slide, that I will be talking about the analysis of Kakuma Refugee Camp as a marketplace. Next slide, please. Next. Great. Kakuma Refugee Camp as a marketplace. Yes. As I mentioned during my introduction, the reason why I wanted to implement this project is because I had a deep respect for the resilience of refugees and their families. I mean, you can imagine leaving your home and having nothing to start by, going to a new country and starting to make a life for yourself. So before I get into the analysis of Kakuma Refugee Camp as a marketplace, it is important for me to give a brief historical background of how Kakuma was formed. Kakuma Refugee Camp was formed in 1992 after the arrival of the Lost Boys of Sudan. The Lost Boys of Sudan is a term used to coin young, 20,000 plus young people that were fleeing the Southern Army during the Civil War of South. They were fleeing death and induction by the. So that's how Kakuma was formed. But over the last 20 years, Kakuma Refugee Camp has seen an influx of refugees from other conflict-prone countries like Somalia. So currently, Kakuma Refugee Camp has a population of 20,000 refugees, as per a 2020 report by the United Nations High Commission. So the reason why I'm giving this historical context, I want you to see the kind of economic bubble that has grown in the last 20 years in Kakuma. So recently, the International Finance Corporation did a report that showcased that Kakuma had an accumulative economic weight of $56 million a year. I know I can't see the audience right now, but I just want that to sink in. $56 million. And it also noted that the private sector was inclusive of about 2,500 private businesses. However, the lack of sustainable financial services was an enormous hurdle to not just a lot of businesses expanding and also young refugees leveraging on entrepreneurship to be able to expand their self-reliance and economic independence. And that takes us back to the importance of financial inclusion. You can imagine if we have an ecosystem, people that in a camp, you're enclosed in a camp, because Kenya, for example, Kakuma Refugee Camp, there's the encampment policy where refugees are not allowed to leave. So when bureaucratic policies are trying to bring you down, these people are still gone ahead to create an economy of their own. You can imagine what would happen if stakeholders invested in ensuring that much there's a lot of hurdles, there's a lot of challenges in creation of business Kakuma, these people are able to access mainstream banking services. That's why I wanted to show an analysis of Kakuma as a refugee, as a marketplace, the importance of financial inclusion playing into ensuring that young refugees are able to leverage on entrepreneurship. And before I go on to my slide, to bring this into context, I want to highlight one of the stories of one of the 5 refugees that I worked with during the implementation of our project. This story is of a young man named Innocent. Innocent is a Burundian refugee that fled Burundi in 2012 and arrived in Kakuma the same year. He fled when he was a second-year law student. I'm a law student. I'm get a bit confused. When he fled Burundi when he was a chemistry student. So in 2015, Innocent started a soap-making business in Kakuma Refugee Camp. So his business currently employs 40 people, 18 of whom are Kenyans. And during the fight of against COVID-19, his business has been so critical because it supplied soaps to schools, local businesses, and also international local agencies. So that story by Innocent just avers the importance and the value proposition that refugees bring to their communities. It also showcases and debunks the notion that refugees are just recipients of aid, but are also active value. They bring so much value into their host communities. So that story just shows what kind of businesses that are happening in Kakuma, the 2,500 businesses that were mapped out by the International Finance Corporation. So I will move to the next slide. Advocacy activities. So I will highlight a few of the advocacy activities that I carried out during the implementation of my project. I'm very happy that CIPE sponsored me to be able to travel to Kakuma Refugee Camp and interact with the youth business community there. But before I left for Kakuma, I conducted 2 workshops with refugee entrepreneurs from a refugee-led organization called Kakuma Youth Voices. And these 2 online workshops focused on how refugee entrepreneurs could use their authentic voices to advocate for their financial inclusion. Some of the issues that refugee entrepreneurs highlighted towards the lack of financial inclusion is the lack of proper documentation. They also showcase that a lot of banking services do not yet understand refugees as a client base. Therefore, when they approach banking services either in Kakuma town or the camp, these people are not aware how refugees are a protected class, nor do they know how to bank them. So that one of the things I learned during that workshop, that it is important for private stakeholders and governments, especially government, to implement effective policies that financial inclusion of refugees is pushed forward. And then secondly, it is important for the private sector also to be able to invest in market research to ensure that the refugees as a new client base. The next advocacy activity that I carried out is 2 physical workshops, Global Shapers, hosted by the World Economic Forum, and Solidarity Initiative for Refugees, a refugee-led organization in Kakuma. And we discussed innovative ways in which we could tackle financial inclusion of refugees. This is one of the most interesting advocacy activities that I carried out. So for this project, I learned about a bank in Malawi in a camp called Dazakela. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. It's called Dazakela camp. There's a bank called My Bucks that is using fintech technology to be able to widen acceptable forms of identification for refugees, and has also sought a waiver for Bank of Malawi to ensure that it's able to use UNHCR forms, which are the United Nations High Commissioner forms, given to refugees as acceptable form. So when I read about that story, I thought of myself, apart from my advocacy, what innovative way could I come up with to ensure that I also part of the solution about financial inclusion of refugees. So the Global Shapers and I, during the 2 physical workshops, came up with a criteria, and we wanted to use this criteria to create an evolving fund of $5,000 to support 5 refugee entrepreneurs in Kakuma that will be showcased in my youth corner, and ensure that these 5 refugee entrepreneurs, regardless of lack of financial, are able to expand their businesses. So I wanted to use this pilot program to be able to showcase the business potential that is there in supporting refugee entrepreneurs to be able to leverage on entrepreneurship and other market-oriented solutions. The criteria for our evolving fund includes things like a person has to be a global shaper, and global shapers have already received financial literacy training from other international organizations in Kakuma. Secondly, it must be a young person who is already running a business that has been running for the last year. There's also a young person working towards creation of a social, solving a social issue, like Innocent, for example, soap making and helping international organization curb COVID-19. And then also lastly, it must be a young person who is a refugee living in Kakuma. So I know I'm not going to be able to present all those stories, but I would encourage everybody to go check the Youth Corner, the incredible stories of young people that are showcasing so much resilience and just need an ecosystem for them to be able to attain self-reliance by ensuring that they're able to access loans and access mainstream banking services. Next slide. Yes. So the next activity, I was able to work with the Chamber of Commerce, and the most interesting working with the Turkana Chamber of Commerce, I was able to learn about the humanitarian development nexus when it comes to the communities that host refugees, and how that can be a value addition to the host community, how that can push the development of host communities. So the Turkana Chamber of Commerce is a voice for businesses in this county, and it's also working to ensure that refugees are financially included, because financial inclusion is also a big problem for the host community. So how the Turkana Chamber of Commerce is doing this, it has created a program where it's allowing refugees, either in the Kakuma Refugee Camp or the Kalobe Integrated Camp, to become part of the chamber. So once refugees have access to that certificate as members of the chamber, they're able to even move around to buy goods for their businesses, and then hopefully they're working towards financial inclusion. So for this specific workshop, I was able to attend a workshop with the financial providers in Turkana West, just to brainstorm and to understand from their perspective what were the barriers of bankers including refugees into the banking system. One of the things that was highlighted during the workshop is that, as I stated earlier, there isn't enough market research of refugees as a client base. Secondly, there are a lot of barriers in regards to policy by government. For example, know your customer regulations that require to have passports and proper identification. Remember, refugees are people that are forcibly displaced. I mean, when you're leaving your house, I don't think sometimes, and you're fleeing conflict, you're likely to passport. So they do not have this identification materials. And then secondly, the high risk of, there isn't alternative methods or modes of assess or curbing risk when it comes to being able to financially include refugees. So the Turkana Chamber of Commerce and I, on a long term, are looking into ways we could support and advocate for the implementation of proper policy to ensure that banks can financially include refugees. And then not only that, also to curb or debunk the notion that refugees are just recipients of aid, but also to showcase the business potential in financially including refugees. The advocacy activity. Next slide. Yes. Okay. So the third advocacy activity was I participated in a workshop with the Turkana Chamber of Commerce, as discussed in the Kalo Bay. In Kakuma, the camp is divided into two. They're trying to come up an integrated camp where the host community and also the refugees trying to live together. So we went with the Turkana Chamber of Commerce, and they were doing a project with the International Labour Organization, and we met some of the already integrated refugees that have become part of the Turkana Chamber of Commerce. So it helped me to understand the role of the chamber, and even just the role of chambers worldwide in the sector in advocating for refugee rights and refugee financial inclusion. So let me move to the challenges. Next slide. Governmental challenges. So I'm going to talk about the governmental challenges towards financial inclusion. I've highlighted a few in my presentation, but here I'm just going to make emphasis, and I'm going to be correlating both challenges and recommendations at the same time. So one of the biggest challenges in regards to financial inclusion, and I feel personally is the biggest challenge, is implementation of the effective implementation of policy in regards to financial inclusion of refugees. All over the world, there are a lot of international instruments, even here in Kenya, or local instruments that believe that financial inclusion of refugees is a right. However, due to lack of proper implementation, this has been able to happen. I'll just go through the challenges and I'll go through the recommendation. I wanted to merge them, but I think it's best I do. The other thing is lack of a wide range of acceptable forms of IDs that comply with regulations for refugees. This is also a policy issue. As I mentioned, one of the banks that inspired me to come up with the revolving fund to provide $5,000 for the entrepreneurs I was working with is that my bank, it's called My Back's Bank in Malawi. It approached the Central Bank of Malawi to request a waiver of the Know Your Customer policy so that they could be able to bank the refugees in that particular camp using the UNHCR forms. So the only way this can happen is if governments are able to implement policies that allow for alternative documentation for refugees. So I think this is an important issue, an important policy issue that both the private sector should advocate for and the government should invest in to ensure that the business potential of refugees as client base are utilized. So I think I've also mentioned the third. I'll just go to the next slide, recommendations. My recommendations, challenges by the private sector, The challenges by the private sector, as earlier mentioned, is a lack of an analysis of market data to understand refugees as a client base, because refugees are a distinct client base, and they have, and it's due to the protracted nature of armed conflict, certain needs. So it's important for bankers to be able to invest in understanding refugees as a client base. Secondly, is rigid modes of mitigating risk while serving refugee population. And this is factored in by misinformation and reputational risk of this protected class. As I mentioned, there's this bank that I've been looking at as a case study. What they did when they went to the Bank of Malawi, they have a 100% payment rate for their loans. And how that they do it, they give group loans. So if banks could invest in other ways of mitigating risk, it will be play into a big role of ensuring that refugees are financially included. So the next one is government regulation. And we have also seen that if government remove this regulation, it will enable the private sector to invest more to ensure that they financially include refugees. So recommendation. My recommendation, and one of the recommendations that I think would create an ecosystem for us to address this inequality, is effective implementation of government policy. And government policy would play into having a wider range of acceptable for refugees. And secondly, also removal of barriers such as Know Your Customer regulation that hinders financial services for refugees. For the private sector recommendation, the next slide, please. Private sector recommendation would be investment of studies to analyze market data to effectively target refugees as a banking client, establish alternative modes such as group loaning to mitigate risk while serving refugee populations, and also flex a private sector working I know in the keynote speech it was mentioned that it's important for us to have public-private dialogues to ensure that we address the most striking challenges of our time. So it's important for the public sector and the private sector to sit down to see how do we include this marginalized community. So it's important for the private sector to advocate and for the government to listen to this, not only just as issue, but also as a business opportunity to create both employment for the refugees and also employment for the host community. Next slide. Moving forward, the private sector is in a unique place to address financial inclusion because they are the people that invest in financial inclusion. They're in a unique position as bank providers and have largely overlooked this viable client segment for a very long time. As I mentioned, it's important for us to have partnership between the private sector and government to analyze ways in which they can work together to be able to address the financial inclusion. Personally, as a young person that is very passionate about market-oriented solutions and the role they play in expansion of marginalized communities such as refugees, I believe forward to working with the Center for International Private Enterprise to advocate for better policies. And I think also advocating for better policy is looking into capacity building of these government institutions that implement these policies, because there's a lot of misinformation refugees. So capacity building of government institutions to ensure that there's proper implementation of policy that therefore ensure that there's an ecosystem for the private sector to be able to invest in the financial inclusion of refugees. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you found this presentation informative, and we'll all work towards including refugees as active economic actors in our economies to ensure that we rebuild more inclusive and resilient economies in a post-COVID-19 world.
Thank you so much, Doris, for that wonderful presentation. It's so obvious that your passion for this subject and your dedication to telling these important stories of people that would not be able to tell them otherwise it's just admirable. And we're so proud to have selected you for our first youth leadership program. And I just wanted to tell the audience a little bit that at CIPE, we have worked on refugee entrepreneurship a little bit, and we believe that enhancing the enabling environment of refugees is critical to self-reliance, of course, and access to sustainable livelihoods. But, the role that the private sector can play, as Doris was explaining a little bit, by engaging in some of the advocacy initiatives that she engaged in and that we've engaged in at CIPE to facilitate refugees' financial inclusion is incredibly important to a more sustainable future for them and for the host countries that they're in. So I'd encourage the audience to ask questions. I'm going to start off by asking one of my own, which is, Doris, we'd love to kind of hear what you'd like to do next. In continuing this project, what key stakeholders, for instance, would you like to work with, and where do you see this initiative going in the future, perhaps in the next few months or a year? Where would you like to take this project?
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ritika, for your question. As I highlighted, one of the biggest supporters for my implementation project was the Turkana Chamber of Commerce. I feel like the Turkana Chamber of Commerce plays a very big role in showing the business potential for bankers in serving refugees. So I think moving forward is working with the Turkana Chamber of Commerce to also build capacity with other government or institutions to see the viability in serving refugees as a business potential. I think, as we say, money runs the world. So I feel like it's better when people see the business potential other than seeing it as charity, because refugees are already doing a lot for themselves. So it's important for the private sector to see, okay, what would they get in this? So I think moving forward is working with the Turkana Chamber of Commerce to work with other private stakeholders to see the viability of refugees as a client base for bankers. And then secondly, I think from the private sector, if there's momentum from the private sector to see the value proposition that refugees bring, is now pressing and advocating for government institutions to do more. And I think government institutions, where the reason why there's a lack of implementation of already existing policies that says that financial inclusion is a right for refugees, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, or there's just a brush of refugees, people comes waiting for aid and not looking at them as active economic actors within host communities. So I think it's important to build capacity within government institutions for them to see the massive potential, already existing potential for this country, for refugees that are in Kakuma Refugee Camp. Because when refugees are leaving their countries, like Innocent, he was a second-year chemistry student who started a soap making business. They already have existing skills. There's already a lot of international organizations that are doing capacity building. But you cannot be doing capacity building and people already have existing skills for their conflict-prone countries, and as a country, you're not taking advantage of this. So I think it's important for both the private sector and the government sector to understand that potential, and then moving forward, we could work towards the effective implementation of both policies and also more investing with regards to bankers financially including refugees. So that's how I see moving forward in the next 1 year.
Great, thank you. And we hope to continue working with you in some capacity on some of these advocacy initiatives. But the one thing, too, that I wanted to ask about, and I'm hoping to get a little more information from you on, is when it comes to government and increasing the capacity of government agencies and enabling governments to do a better job of recognizing refugees as important economic contributors. What are ways that we might do that as young people or as just a civil society? What are some ways that we could work with government to achieve some of these objectives?
Okay, great. I'm very passionate about policy, and I think how you make government understand first before we even get to the government is an output of seats chosen by people in local communities. So I feel when you come talking about refugee and financial inclusion, first, the most important thing is to ensure that the local communities, even just the host communities, understand the value proposition of refugees. Therefore, if they understand the proposition of refugees, then they will be pushing governments through the kind of leaders they vote, how they are interacting with their government officials, either in a local or government county, to be able to take refugee issues seriously. So I think from a government level first, before we even get to government, because government only listens to what is a priority for the people. It is first important to educate the people about the value proposition of refugees. Because as you see in a world of a lot of misinformation and a lot of hostility about refugees, a lot of host communities are able to see past that misinformation to the value proposition that refugees bring. So if there's already a hostility in the masses that elect governments, then it means that governments are also hostile towards refugees. So first, we need to educate just normal folk about the value proposition of refugees. When you educate the normal folk, then the government is forced to, because government has to, according to the social contract, government has to listen to the priorities of the people. So once you educate the local communities, then that translates to how government policies are implemented.
That makes sense. I wish that we could continue the conversation since there's so much more to talk about, but we are at time. So let me thank you so much, Doris, for your hard work during the last few months of the CIPE Youth Leadership Program. We will make your presentation available to the audience after this conference is over. And now we will turn it over to the next session. So thank you very much.